people on mute and record the session. So thanks for being here for the last part of our elevation certificate series. So we'll be covering section C, D, and then the insurance sections H and I. If you weren't able to make the last two sessions, those have been recorded and have been put on our YouTube channel. So if you wanted to catch up on those, they are available. So what is the elevation certificate? It is an official FEMA document that certifies and verifies elevations of different structural aspects um, for compliance for floodplain management. And so making sure that a structure is built in compliance with federal, state, and local requirements. So these are only given for structures, and they can be used in support of a letter of map change application. So if you have an elevation certificate with certified elevations, you would not have to get another survey to apply for a LOMA or a LOMA RF. These are required for new and substantially improved structures in the floodplain. And at the end of the construction, we need the finished elevation certificate. But they can be done during the construction process, and it might be a good idea to require those, but we do need the completed one. So in Kansas, this is a surveyor or an engineer, not an architect. And the form is not mandated by FEMA, it's just highly recommended because it has all of those details and information that would be needed to verify compliance for permitting. Um, and once it's certified, the elevation certificate doesn't expire as long as it was certified on the form that was current at that time that it was certified. So it can only be invalidated by changes to the actual structure. So when this was first released in 2022, there were a couple of issues with the form that it wasn't allowing certain types of entries to be made. So they re-released it in November of 2023 to improve that functionality. For alphanumeric entries, it was automatically rounding stuff, which is not good. It would lock easily. Um, so there was just some other issues that were straightened out. And so if you ended up downloading a copy of that form before that date, you would maybe want to go back and re-download it. So the sections that can be completed, so we went over A and B on Monday. So those are anyone. Here we're looking at C and D, which is the licensed professional. We went over E, F, and G yesterday, so that's anyone, and section G is for the local official. And then down at the bottom for the new sections that have been added to this version of the form, um, anyone can fill out H and I, and those are just for the insurance policies. So, um, section C is the building information. So this is the probably the most pertinent part of the form as far as verifying compliance. So this part, we're looking at those different building characteristics. So um, the structure is located in an area that has a base flood elevation or a flood depth. And so we went over yesterday, that would be in section B. So we're going to be comparing some of these elevations to that number to make sure it's elevated properly. So again, a licensed engineer or a surveyor can fill out this section. So C2, section C2 has now clarified that it can also be used for AO zones or A99, which I don't think we have any of those. In the state, C1 is indicating what the elevations are based on. So you can submit construction drawings or a building that's under construction. And those might be useful to ensure that it's being elevated properly while it's being built still, before the finished elevation certificate is done, just to make sure that when the lowest floor is being put in, that it's elevated, because it's much easier to fix that while it's under construction than it would be afterwards. So there's now a conversion factor checkbox. So if you had to convert the datum because maybe it's an older map that is in the older NGVD 29 datum and you'd had to convert it to the NAVD 88, you would check yes and then describe that conversion in the comments section, which is section D. So this can be used to determine what the first floor height is in any zone. And first floor height is an insurance term. So you can get a policy, of course, with this section by the licensed professional. They just added in the option to uh, get an insurance policy without requiring the survey. So we will go over that and some of these terms. An attached garage should go into C2D. It's not considered an enclosure. And C2C, it used to say that it was only for V zones, which are coastal high hazard zones. They now encourage it to be used for diagrams 5 and 6 as additional information for that structure. So they took that only for V zones language out. Um, and then C2, F and G. So that's the lowest and highest adjacent grade that's touching the structure, and they ask if it's natural or finished, meaning if it's on fill. So as I mentioned, the first floor height terms, so there's different terms that have different meaning. So the bottom floor elevation and C2A is the elevation of the bottom floor, the top of the bottom floor. This is referring to whatever the bottom floor of the building is. So if it has a basement, it would be the basement floor or the crawl space floor or the floor of the enclosure. And so this is just determined by how the structure is built, but whatever that bottom floor is. Whereas lowest floor is a floodplain management term, and it is defined as the lowest enclosed area, including a basement. And it's not the enclosure. So this is typically the lowest living floor. It would always include a basement. And this is not determined by the surveyor, it's determined by the floodplain administrator. Excuse me. So this is an interpretation that you would have by doing inspections and reading the elevation certificate to determine what the lowest floor is for compliance, because that's the floor that would need to be elevated at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, unless you have a higher freeboard than that. Just making sure it's compliant with the local regulations. So this is no longer used for insurance rating purposes. It used to be whatever your lowest floor was versus the base flood elevation, we could tell you what your insurance premium would look like. However, that's no longer the case. FEMA now takes into consideration the first floor height, which is an insurance term, and it's basically whatever the first floor above the adjacent grade is. And so that's one factor that's used in insurance rating. It kind of goes into a black box that we don't really have access to, where they compare it to catastrophe modeling and distance from the flooding source and expected velocities, etc. So all this other data that it gets compared against. So for floodplain management, the lowest floor is an important term, and it's based on those multiple factors. Um, and there's now that section G for the floodplain administrator to fill out. So anytime someone submits information or an application for new construction and that kind of thing, Section G is now completed by the floodplain administrator. That kind of serves as a checklist to make sure that things are being permitted properly. So there has been some confusion sometimes about garage versus enclosure. So if you look on the right, the full story enclosure, that's a diagram 7. Sometimes an enclosure like that is used as a garage. So you see it has the garage doors on it and it's used for parking, storage, and building access. But it's not considered an attached garage. That's considered a full story enclosure. Whereas on um, the left, this is a slab on grade diagram 1A, um, and it has an attached garage. So it's adjacent to the structure, it's not elevating it. Um, Typically, enclosures are elevating the structure. So it would be filled out a little bit differently. Um, but there's, a section for attached garages. And then C2D is the area where you would put the uh, slab elevation for the attached garage. So what FEMA considers the lowest floor, it would always include a basement if there is one, the lowest enclosed area. So again, a compliant, unfinished, flood-resistant enclosure that has the flood openings that's used only for parking, building access, and storage, other than a basement area, is not considered the lowest floor. Um, it would be the bottom floor, but not the lowest floor. So as long as it's not built to put the structure in violation um, of the requirements. So if the lowest enclosed area is used for any other purpose than that, then it would be considered the lowest floor. So that's why we have non-conversion agreements to make sure people aren't converting their enclosures into living space. And again, the floor of a basement will always be the lowest floor, regardless of how the space is used, and it's most likely the bottom floor as well. So line C1, as I mentioned, this is what the elevations are based on. If it's under construction or finished construction. Of course, we always need the finished by the end to approve the final permits. Um, so verifying the site plans, making sure that it's being built as proposed. You want to do inspections, the most important being when the lowest floor is going in. And then you might consider requiring them to submit the under construction elevation certificate just to better track that development and make sure it's compliant. So C2 is the line for the benchmark. So there's a unique identifier for benchmarks that's registered with the NGS, or the National Geodetic Service. So they maintain those markers. And so the vertical datum for the benchmark elevations in section C need to be the same as the base flood elevation. And so if you end up having to convert that, you need to show the conversion and indicate how it was done. And so for GPS survey, you'd want to indicate the benchmark for the base station. And then if you use Opus, and I'll show you what that is, but it's for surveying. If that's used, then you want to attach that report that comes with it. So here's the NGS site. You can see all the different benchmarks that have been, maintained by the NGS in their database and their interactive map. And that way you know where they are, how to access them, and how they've been maintained. So it used to be just kind of just a big description in the map, on the flood insurance rate map of where they're located and what they are. But since, things can change and they can be moved or removed, the NGS now, instead of FEMA, maintains these. And so they have this interactive map and all these resources that you can use to determine that information for the benchmark. And it's important because a mismatched datum in that way between the 88 and the 29 datum could really cause issues. And this is showing how much they are in difference across the country in the areas that it could be impacted. So we're kind of in that 20 to 40 centimeters in difference. So, that could really cause some issues and a potentially un unintentional low floor violation. So we want to avoid that and just make sure that we're checking datums to make sure that they're all aligned. And so the NGS also has their conversion software to be able to do that. So um, they're really the resource for this kind of stuff. And you can pinpoint the location exactly, enter it that way. As I mentioned, OPIS for the GPS survey, so the operating reference station. Um, Basically, you would go here and make sure everything is calibrated, and then once the survey is done, there is a report that goes with that that should be an attachment to the elevation certificate, and then there's the link down below. Survey stakes, they are really important for developers, obviously to make sure that things are elevated properly, but they have been misread or intentionally tampered with by property owners. We've had a case where a property owner, after the survey stakes were placed, just kind of went out and like pushed it into the ground, and that led to a low floor issue. So part of doing inspections, having the developer there with you, um, all of that, just making sure it's correctly and hasn't been tampered with, because that could be a very costly error. So again, once it's staked out, it should be inspected to make sure that it's um, lining up with the siting plans. And then, of course, making sure that it's indicating that the lowest floor will be elevated properly. So C2A through H. So these are all of those elevation points that I've mentioned. So um, again, we want to make sure that the datum is the same or converted to the same. So there is a yes or no checkbox for that. They added this just to make sure that it wasn't overlooked, to try to cut down on mistakes. And then there's also a note to describe the conversion factor in the comment section. And so again, this is where terminology becomes important and what we mean by the top of the bottom floor. As I mentioned, it would be, of course, the basement or whatever the bottom floor of that building is, either a crawl space floor or maybe it's a slab on grade, so it's just a slab. But it would also be, you know, the floor of an enclosure if that was part of it. And so none of these should be left blank. And if it doesn't apply, just put NA. That's what should be entered. Otherwise, it's hard to tell if it was overlooked or if it's not there or if it doesn't apply. So again, the diagram determines where these measurements are taken. And again, C2C can be entered for diagrams 5 and 6. So those are the ones that are elevated on piers, posts, or piles. Um, and there's nothing underneath, or diagram 6 has a partial enclosure. So these can be taken in any zone, and it might be helpful in a riverine floodplain, just knowing where that's located in relationship to the top of the bottom floor, because that would be um, either the enclosure floor or the floor of the elevated structure. So it might be helpful with debris lines, or in case of ice jams and things like that. The floodplain administrator may want that information. All structures have a lowest horizontal structural member. It's just depending on how it's built, where those are located, it might be below ground. Um, and then always use feet for the continental United States. Um, Only Puerto Rico is going to use meters. So then in the instructions, it kind of gives you, based on the diagram type, where these measurements are taken. So top of the bottom floor for diagram 1A or 1B, those are slab on grade, so it's just the top of the slab. And then, of course, the next higher floor would be, if there is a next higher floor, it may or may not apply. If not, it would just be NA. And then C2F through H for all of them will just depend on what the existing grade is at that site. And then, of course, 2A and 2B are both basements, so C2A would be the basement floor, and then whatever's above that, C2B would be the next higher floor. Same thing, split levels, so you have the bottom floor, which is either a basement or at least at grade on one side, and then the split level part of it would be the next higher floor, so it's adjacent to it, but it is the next higher floor. And then F through H, again, all depends on the grading. And then 5 and 6, which I mentioned, C2A for a diagram 5, it's completely elevated. There's nothing underneath it. So it's just that elevated floor. And then C2B, next higher floor, if there is one. Um, and then this is where C2C comes into play, where you can get the lowest horizontal structural member. And that's just good information to have. Um, for these types of diagrams. And then diagram 6, C2A is the top of the enclosure floor, and then C2B would be the elevated floor. And then for section A, in A8, we went over this on Monday, but those are the information for flood openings. So for enclosures, they need to have flood openings, and so that would be documented in section A. And you can go back and watch that if you'd like. And then again, C2C, good information to have, lowest horizontal structural member, and then as with all of them, F through H is dependent on the grading. So diagrams 7, 8, and 9, these are full story enclosures and crawl spaces. So C2A would be the enclosure floor for all of them. So the bottom of that crawl space floor or the top of the slab for the full story enclosure. So for that one, C2B, whatever's above that, A through 8 or A8 is the flood opening, so you can see those on the enclosure wall. Um, so yeah, um, and then A8A is like garage. So yeah, again, there is a bit of difference between um, garages and enclosures. So even with that being said, there are still nuances and kind of these construction anomalies. It always kind of feels like it's going to be black and white, but there are buildings that have mixed foundations. So diagram numbers are a best fit for whatever the construction details are. That is just something to be aware of. Um, we do also have an elevation certificate instructional video that we came out with earlier this year, and that's also on our YouTube channel. And it's more of an illustrated animation type of training that shows you where all these measurements are taken from. And it's just another resource that we put together. Again, for the crawl spaces, C2A is the crawl space floor, C2B is whatever is above that. And then we document the flood openings, and then these ones show you the highest and lowest adjacent grade, C2, G, and F. Uh, and then just kind of showing a little bit more slab on grade. These illustrations, there were illustrations in the last version, but these have been kind of updated and they show a little bit more detail. And so building with a basement, it's showing the basement floor. And then for the post piers or piles 5 and 6 diagrams, it shows you top of the bottom floor and then the lowest horizontal structural members. So um, the instructions have been expanded quite a bit. So if you ever get confused, that's a very good resource to look into. Um, So lowest adjacent grade, in this case, we have an elevated building on, which is a loading dock. So C2F, which is the lowest adjacent grade, is there at the bottom of that loading dock. That's the lowest point that is touching the foundation of the structure. So that's the number that goes there. And then you can describe that in the comments section about how um, this is uniquely set up. and it makes sense that um, it would be low in that way for the purposes of this building, which is, commercial loading docks. So it's going to have this type of feature that can be described in the comments, which is usually just there's standard information that goes in there, and then any special characteristics like this that you would want to describe in there so that it makes sense to anyone reading the certificate what the situation is. Um, and then this is showing C2E, that's the lowest machinery or equipment that services the building. So whatever that is, even if all of it's on the roof, that would be described for section E, and then they ask that you describe what that machinery or equipment is in the comments section. So in this case, we have a house with an attached garage, and their lowest machinery or equipment is the hot water heater that has been secured to a platform in the garage. And so that's what that is. And then C2F, their lowest adjacent grade, and then C2D, the garage top of the slab. And it's just kind of illustrating what that might look like for a typical residential building. So C2, F, G, and H. So F, the finished lowest adjacent grade that's next to and in direct contact with the foundation. And that number will determine whether it's eligible for a LOMA or a LOMAR F. So that number has to be at or above the base flood elevation. And so that's what they look at when you submit an elevation certificate in support of a letter of map change. And then, of course, now with this version of the form, we're indicating if that's natural or finished grade. And natural grade is undisturbed natural surface that has not been excavated or filled. Um, For AO zones, you'd want to use natural grade if possible, and then attach the source information for that, like a grading plan or whatever the case may be. Highest adjacent grade, same supporting source information, and then H. C2H is whatever deck or stairs is structurally attached to a building. And this is also taken into consideration for letters of map change. They also have to be at or above the base flood elevation if it's applicable. So that would be lowest ground, sidewalk, or patio slab that's next to and touching and structurally attached deck or stairs that support the building. Um, I think there have been a few cases where there is a deck or stairs, but it's not necessarily structurally attached to the building. So it's called floating or freestanding. So that's something to be aware of that you'd want to verify how exactly it's constructed. Um, or if it's attached deck that relies on both structural posts and the house framing for support. And that's what we define as structurally connected. So, um, it can be difficult to access crawl spaces for the purpose of getting those measurements. The instructions do kind of go over this. You could measure the distance from the crawl space floor to the next higher floor and subtract exterior grade measured next to the higher floor. There may be construction details and permitting details on it. The property owner may have documentation on it, and you can verify that by looking through the vents, through the flood vents, and then try and use section D to explain how you got that elevation. Again, C2E, lowest machinery or equipment that is servicing the building. FEMA had done a lot of payouts on insurance claims for HVAC units that were submerged, and now they are required to be at or above the base flood elevation. Um, right. So if it's left on the ground, that's still a compliance issue in the floodplain. They make plenty of platforms that are either next to the house or attached to the house that can support it and secure it above the base flood elevation, because that would still be a violation of the regulation. So all of the ordinances say that it needs to be at or above, unless there's other freeboard requirements. But if it's a utility that's actually owned by another company, it doesn't count. So we've had this come up with like meters and other things like that. It doesn't count for the elevation certificate for that property owner's structure. So there is technical bulletin, let's see, no, sorry, uh, requirements for um, flood openings. So this is technical bulletin one. Um, so it goes over what the requirements are for flood openings and what options are. Um, and FEMA takes into consideration flood openings that are, within 1 foot of grade and meet all of those requirements. There should be a 5% discount that's being applied for elevated machinery and equipment and proper flood venting. So they call it mitigation credits, and so it's basically written into the policy at the time that that's put together. There's a lot of different structural characteristics that factor into the premium, including like the foundation type, um, what type of structure it is, if it's like CMU concrete or if it's stick-based, those different kinds of things. Um, yeah, those building materials. And so there is a risk rating discount guide that's available online. So common errors that happen in section C, if C2A is not measured from the basement or crawl space floor, there's been mistakes about what the top of the bottom floor is, and we've had at least one person that were trying to help the property owner and didn't do it correctly on purpose, but that's very rare. C2B for a multi-story building is left blank, or it's recorded the same as C2A. C2C left blank instead of putting NA or putting that value in there. C2D being left blank. And then it's not clear if there's a garage or if a garage may have been missed. C2E is left blank, or you don't describe what that machinery and equipment is in section D, which includes all of those that are listed, electrical, heating, ventilation, etc., regardless of the location. C2H is left blank when it should have a number for deck or stairs. And sometimes the floodplain administrator will require information about duct work to be documented. Okay. So if you're in the CRS program, there is a new checklist and guidance and a memo of correction. Um, I think, regular communities may benefit from using it as well. It just kind of goes over all the important sections that you'd need to verify. And so CRS communities have to do this annually to recertify their program. So you don't ever have to accept an incomplete certificate. You can always send it back and ask for corrections or um, additional information from the surveyor or the engineer. Um, we need finished and correct elevation certificates, and those should be conditional of issuing the certificate of occupancy. So withholding that certificate can really serve as a deterrent or as an incentive to make sure everything is correct and submitted. Of course, no-rise certifications are required for any floodway developments. So these are the areas where the velocity is usually fastest. Um, the no-rise would be required here. The engineer needs to evaluate the hydraulic impact, and it needs to be signed, sealed, and dated by an engineer. Of course, and then elevating on crawl spaces and fill. So utilities are elevated above the base flood elevation, as I mentioned, and then that enclosure is equipped with flood openings or fill, which is free of construction debris. You may need a DWR floodplain fill permit for that type of development, if it's on average a foot or more. And we can give a determination on that. And then there are requirements in that for vegetation and sloping. Accessory structure is very common. It has to be elevated and have an elevation certificate like any other building, unless they meet the standards for wet flood proofing, which is in everyone's ordinance at this point, at least if it's been updated in the last 10 years. So if it's not habitable, anchored, has openings, it's made of flood damage resistant materials, utilities are elevated, and it has usage of only storage or parking, and that cannot be modified in the future. So if it meets all of the requirements, it can be built at grade with flood openings and not require an elevation certificate. Um, Ag structures very common in Kansas, so again, it would have to meet the same standards like any other non-residential building, unless they meet the standards for wet flood proofing, um, which means it's permitted, obviously, but single wall design, not habitable, anchored, damage-resistant materials, no retail, wholesale, or manufacturing use, and it has to have a variance and flood openings. And for this, we're looking for low damage potential ag structures, not something that could cause damage in the event of a flood, like the housing of like livestock and animals or dangerous chemicals, that kind of thing. So the community considers that when the variance is issued. And so there is this guidance document that came out in 2021. It's very detailed. It goes over all the considerations to make and the guidelines for accessory and ag structures when we want to wet floodproof them. It also has model ordinance language and other things like that. And then section D, so this is where the surveyor or the engineer in Kansas would certify the elevations that they've entered in section C. And then of course, this is where the comments section go, where they would want to add all of that additional information. So they sign and seal it, address and all of that information there. And then the comments, so of course, any anomalies and unusual building characteristics would go in here, but also typically the information for how the Latin long was obtained, describe any engineered openings, and then you'd want to attach the rating certificate on that, so indicating who the manufacturer is and the model number. If there's a low MAR in place, that you would have that as an attachment and have the case number and effective dates, the base flood elevation source data. So we talked about that yesterday. Any datum conversions for C2, grading plans, the OPUS report if that applies, the type and location for C2E of the machinery and equipment, or any other relevant information, and you can find a complete description of that in the instructions. So this should never be left blank. It should at the very least have that basic information about C2E and the Latin long and stuff like that. So of course you are certifying um, that you are a licensed um, surveyor engineer and that you are telling the truth to the best of your efforts and interpretation of the data. And of course, if you purposely falsify that, it is a crime. But, that pretty much almost never happens. And then the new sections, H and I, of course, this certificate's been out for a couple of years, but it is new to this version of it. These are just for the insurance. Again, it can be completed by anybody. Um, So this is where the first floor height comes into play. And then we do look at machinery and equipment to see if they're elevated. And then I is the certification section, unless it's the community official who uses section G. And these are not required to get a policy, but it may help with the premium and earn discounts. So um, if you submit this, they will FEMA has their risk rating engine, which basically generates your premium. And so if you submit this and it benefits you more, they will use this instead of whatever they've come up with, but they'll use whichever one benefits the property owner or the policy holder the most. So again, reasons only, so we have to have A and B filled out. So again, that's the property information and the mapping information. And then the local official has section G, and then H and I shows what the first floor height is, and then section I is the certification of whoever filled out section H. So only used for insurance again. Sections A, B, and I are completed. Section H is preferred over section E of the form for first floor height. And if you look back, section E is where it says you can fill out for A zones or AO zones. So they'd rather you do this if you're just getting insurance. If section C is completed, then that's going to prevail over section H, since those are certified elevations. So there's three questions, H1A. So what is the first floor that is above grade? So 1A, 1B, so slabs on grade. Diagram 3, which is the split level that doesn't have a basement. And then 5, 6, 7, and 8 are here. That would be the top of the bottom floor. So crawl spaces or an elevated floor, or the above grade enclosure for diagram 7. So that's the top of the bottom floor. That's above the lowest adjacent grade. So H1B are the ones with the below grade diagram. So basements, and then a below grade crawl space or an enclosure that's below the house. So that would be the top of the next higher floor above the basement, crawl space, or enclosure. Um, so we're not putting any floors that are below ground level in this section. H1A is always whatever the first floor is that's above grade. So H1B for basements and below grade crawl spaces, it's the next higher floor above that. And then you would leave H1A blank or put NA in that. And then H2 is M and E. Is it elevated appropriately? And so there's a diagram for how those should be elevated for the mitigation credit. And where that has to be located is dependent on the diagram. So this is a very basic measurement. It's relative to the lowest adjacent grade that's touching the structure. Again, it's not a surveyed elevation. You can use a tape measure or a yardstick, and you don't need the specialized surveying equipment. Basically, how high off the ground is the first floor? So it's a relative distance from the top of the floor to the existing lowest adjacent grade, the as-built grade, using these measuring tools. So again, H1B, you're measuring this next floor that's over the crawl space or basement. Yeah, and then H1B for a building that doesn't have a below grade area, it's left blank. So you're either filling out H1A or H1B. So H2, again, the machinery and equipment. So if it's a slab on grade, it has to be the floor, the next higher floor. So there may not be one. And so if you have just a one-story slab on grade, that machinery or equipment would have to be at the attic level for that credit. Diagrams 5 and 6, it's just at that elevated floor height. And then it just kind of shows you how this works for insurance credits for the M&E. Um, so I went over those two. So for basements, it's the floor above the basement, and then crawl spaces, it's whatever the floor is above the crawl space. And then the full story enclosure, it just has to be up to the elevated floor. So yeah, it just kind of shows you where that location is. So again, insurance, building coverage will cover AC, furnace, heat pump, water heater, elevator equipment, and if you get contents coverage, it's clothes, washers and dryers, food freezers. Um, yeah, sorry, that's repeated on there. Basically, whatever what makes the house functional as a home. I think it says food in the freezers as well. So people used to be penalized for not elevating. It could make your insurance like 5 times as expensive if you didn't have it elevated properly. That's no longer the case. It does not impact the rating. And so it kind of takes away the incentive that we had for people to elevate their machinery and equipment. But there's been a bit of a split between floodplain management and insurance when they rolled out Risk Rating 2.0. So there are all of these other resources that are available from FEMA. The flood insurance manual, the MT1 technical guidance is good to help you with LOMA and LOMAR-F applications, or whoever the surveyor is. Um, LOMA out is shown. That can be done by the property owner themselves. They don't need a survey for that if they are technically outside of the floodplain. And then the claims manual. And then this is where we refer people when they ask how to find a surveyor. Um, this will help them find someone in their area that can service their structure if they need an elevation certificate or a letter of map change. And then that's my contact information. So now that we have completed the series, I will finally send out everyone's certificates and a follow-up email that has some of these resources. And that's it. I will stop sharing my screen. I don't see anything in the chat, but if anyone wants to come off mute to ask anything. All right. Well, if you think of anything, feel free to send me an email. We're always around to answer questions. And wait, the poll, Keegan.
Yeah, I was about to ask.
Okay. So this is just the poll to ask if you are interested in getting a certificate. Great. I should have them out by next week sometime, I would think. All right. Thanks, everyone.